So welcome everyone to the NCSEM public lecture series and to today's talk, All Fat is Not Equal. So my name is Dr. Scott Willis. I'm a research associate here at Loughborough University, working within the Leicester Biomedical Research Centre. So today's talk is going to be split into two different parts. So in part one, we're going to look at the importance of fat storage location on our metabolic health. And in part two, we're going to look at the importance of the different types of fat that we can store, with a specific focus on the liver, seeing as it's my main area of research. So to begin with, we're going to look at how fat is stored in the human body. So we all have different knowledge on this topic. So we're going to start out basic, and then we're going to get into some of the research that we do here at Loughborough. So we're then going to look at what are the health risks associated with these different fat compartments, and also what strategies can we use to target unhealthy fat accumulation. So what is fat? So fat, or lipids as we know them scientifically, are an energy source which can be stored efficiently in multiple compartments throughout our body for long-term energy storage. So this can come through our diet directly as fat, but also we can convert them from other macronutrients such as protein and carbohydrate. So the World Health Organization defines obesity as the abnormal or excessive accumulation of fat which presents a risk to our health. And we commonly assess this using body mass index. So some of you may have heard of body mass index before, but we calculate this by dividing our weight by our height squared. So on the table here, we have the different BMI categories and the risk of developing health problems associated with these different categories. So firstly, we define normal weight as a BMI of 18.5 to 24.9, and this is associated with the lowest risk to our health. And generally, as our BMI increases, so too does our risk of developing health problems such as high blood pressure, high cholesterol, high blood sugar, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes. So obesity is defined as a BMI of 30 or greater. But what this doesn't tell us is why is it that someone in the obesity category can actually remain relatively metabolically healthy? And on the flip side, why is it that someone in the normal weight category can actually go on to develop some of these health issues that I spoke of before? And this is where the importance of where we are storing our body fat becomes really important. So fat which isn't used as energy is primarily stored in adipose tissue as triglyceride. So the main function of our adipose tissue is this long-term energy storage, which I mentioned, but also as a layer of protection to protect our vital organs, and also as insulation to maintain our core body temperature. Adipose tissue is also an organ which can produce a variety of different hormones, which have a variety of different effects within our body. And most of these stores are what we call subcutaneous adipose tissue. So the word subcutaneous means located just below the skin, which is like the picture you can see on the right here. But actually what we see is that there's a large variation between individuals as where we tend to store most of our body fat. So at the most basic level, we can divide the fat regions into the upper and lower body. So those individuals with obesity who tend to store more fat in their upper body is referred to as android obesity, and those who tend to store more fat in their lower body is referred to as gynoid obesity. So you may have heard of these referred to more commonly as the apple shape and the pear shape. So those individuals with the android or apple shape tend to store more fat around the trunk, more specifically in their abdominal region, which we refer to as central obesity. And importantly, this is associated with higher cardiometabolic risk. And on the flip side, the gynoid or pear shape is characterized by fat accumulation around the hips and thighs, which is thought to be more protective as it almost acts as a buffer from storing fat in these more harmful areas. And this is associated with a lower cardiometabolic risk. And as you can probably tell from the stick figures, the apple shape tends to be more common in males, and the pear shape tends to be more common in females. And we'll go into this a bit later on. So I want to delve deeper into this more abdominal or central fat accumulation, which I mentioned before. And we can do this by using different imaging methods, with the most accurate being MRI. So firstly, we have what's called intra-abdominal subcutaneous adipose tissue, shown by number 1 on the diagram. And this is more superficial fat stored just under the skin, like I mentioned before. And this is typically what we can visually see on ourselves. Going deeper than this, we then have what's called visceral adipose tissue. So this is deeper adipose tissue stores, which are located around our vital organs. And importantly, storing fat within these stores is comparatively more harmful when compared to subcutaneous adipose tissue. And finally, we have what's called ectopic fat. So this simply means fat stored where it's not meant to be. So this can be in our organs such as the liver, the pancreas, the muscle, and the heart. And these organs aren't designed for storing mass amounts of fat. So what tends to happen is the cells become stressed and inflamed, and over time they can begin to die and become replaced by fibrous tissue. And at this point, the organ can no longer function effectively. And this is a key part of the development of some of the diseases I mentioned before, so cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So it's really this ectopic fat which we need to really be careful about. So for those of you who haven't seen a different MRI scans before, so we have one on the right here. And this just quite nicely shows the distinction between the more superficial subcutaneous fat, shown in red, and the deeper, more harmful visceral tissue, shown in green, located around the organs. So let's go back to the question which I proposed before. Why is it that some individuals with obesity, with that BMI above 30, can actually remain relatively metabolically healthy, so have normal blood pressure, normal blood sugar levels, normal cholesterol? And this is what we refer to as metabolically healthy obesity, and it's prevalent in around 10 to 20% of individuals with obesity. So we have the two different types which I mentioned. So these two individuals have the same BMI in that obesity category, but on the left we have an individual who's metabolically healthy, and on the right an individual who's metabolically unhealthy. And what we see is that the metabolically healthy individual has a lower visceral fat volume, so that more harmful fat. And this is also associated with lower amounts of visceral fat and higher amounts of the more protective leg fat, which I mentioned before. And this is also associated with higher fitness levels and physical activity levels. And this is something we'll be focusing on today. They also tend to be more insulin sensitive, have normal amounts of inflammation, and also more normal adipose tissue functioning. But is it all good news for these individuals? So this review here quite nicely summarised different studies in the area, which looked at the risk of different health outcomes in individuals with both metabolically healthy and metabolically unhealthy obesity. And they compared this risk to someone who is metabolically healthy and lean. So the metabolically healthy lean group is shown as the black bar here and the horizontal dotted line. Anything above this line means a greater risk compared to the lean individuals. So let's look at the metabolically unhealthy group first. And what you see is that for each of the different health outcomes, they have a much greater risk than the other two groups. But what's interesting is when you take the metabolically healthy obesity group and compare this to the lean individuals. And you can see that actually in some of these outcomes, they still have a greater risk when compared to the lean individuals. So this is things like cardiovascular disease, heart failure, the cardiovascular events. You can see type 2 diabetes is quite a lot higher, and also all-cause mortality. And what you tend to see in these individuals is that the metabolically healthy state tends to be only temporary, and sort of within the next 10 years, that can then progress to the more metabolically unhealthy version. So unfortunately, it's not all good news for these individuals, and there's still a requirement to treat the obesity in these individuals. So as I mentioned before, there's quite a large variation in where our body fat tends to accumulate. So now we're going to look at some of the factors influencing this. So a key one is our age. So many of you may have used the term in the past, middle-age spread. And I'm afraid to say that this is true. So the older we get, we tend to switch to more central fat accumulation. Our sex is also another contributing factor. So if we go back to those shapes that I mentioned before, males tend to store more fat around the central region, whereas females tend to store more of their fat around the hips and thighs. And it's thought that the female sex hormone estrogen actually has a protective effect within this. And this is quite clearly seen in the menopause, which is associated with a reduction in estrogen levels. And what we typically see is that postmenopausal women tend to then switch to this more central fat accumulation. Genetics is also another key factor. So the location of where we tend to store our fat can actually be inherited through our family. And a key part of this genetic risk is also our ethnicity. So South Asians in particular have a predisposition for central obesity when compared to white Europeans. And the same can be said for white Europeans compared to African Americans. And then finally, we have different modifiable lifestyle factors which can also influence this. So this is things like our diet and physical activity, which again is what we're going to focus on today, but also factors such as our stress levels and our smoking status. So now we're going to look a bit more in detail at what are the physiological mechanisms as to why fat can accumulate in these ectopic regions which aren't built for mass fat storage. And the most commonly talked about theory is what's called the adipose tissue expandability and fat spillover theory. So in the 21st century, our lives have become characterized by an increased energy intake, particularly through processed foods that are high in saturated fat and refined sugars, and also a reduction in energy expenditure through becoming less physically active in place of more sedentary behaviors, like this example, lying on the sofa. So this leads to what we call a positive energy balance. So this means we're taking in more energy than what we're actually spending. So this excess of energy can be stored in our subcutaneous fat, like we mentioned before, and over time, a chronic excess of energy leads to an expansion of our subcutaneous fat stores. But there becomes a point when the cells can actually no longer expand any further. And what happens here is that the cells tend to become inflamed and starved of oxygen, and they also produce these Now, insulin is a really important protein in our body, which promotes a state of storage. And so what we typically find with insulin is that it promotes our adipose tissue to take up fat and store it and prevent the breakdown of fat and release into our circulation. So when our cells become resistant to these effects, what we find is that our adipose tissue switches from a state of storage to a state of breakdown. And this means that fat is released into the circulation or bloodstream, and this is what we refer to as the fat spillover. So the fat spills over into our circulation, and this can then be delivered to the tissues which aren't designed for mass lipid storage. So this is our visceral fat stores, our liver, our pancreas, and our muscle. So importantly, accumulating fat within our liver is a key part of the development of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and fat accumulation in our pancreas is also a key factor in the development of type 2 diabetes. But the main focus today, as I said, is going to be on the liver, as it's what we've done a lot of our research here at Loughborough. So the liver has a really important role in energy metabolism. So it's able to regulate our blood sugar levels by producing it in times of need and also taking it out of the bloodstream in times when there's an excess. It's also able to regulate our blood fats, of which cholesterol is a key one of these. So it has important implications for our cardiovascular or heart health. So maintaining a healthy liver is really important for normal functioning of our body. So fat is stored in our liver cells as lipid droplets, and we can assess this using what's called a liver biopsy. So this is where a small incision is made in the upper abdomen and a biopsy needle is inserted to take a small sample of liver tissue. We can then look at this under the microscope, and this is what a healthy liver would look like. So lipid droplets appear as these white blobs like the one in the bottom right here. So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is diagnosed when lipid droplets are visible in more than 5% of these cells. And this is without the excessive intake of alcohol. So this is what a fatty liver would look like. So you can see a lot more of the appearance of these white lipid droplets. But this is quite an invasive procedure. So we can also assess non-alcoholic fatty liver disease non-invasively using techniques such as MRI and a slightly more advanced technique called magnetic resonance spectroscopy. And we can then use this to determine liver fat percentage, and a percentage above 5.5% is considered non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So this is an MRI scanner for anyone who hasn't seen one before. And this is the one that we use at the Sir Peter Mansfield Imaging Centre in Nottingham for a lot of our research studies. So NAFLD itself actually represents a broad spectrum of different liver diseases. So the early stages of this fatty liver, which we have been talking about on the previous slide, and over time in some individuals, this can lead to more inflammation and also fibrosis in the liver. And this is what we call non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, or NASH for short. And in a subset of these individuals, it can then progress to what we call end-stage liver disease. And this is associated with greater risk of mortality from liver-related outcomes such as cirrhosis and also liver cancer. So the further along the spectrum it goes, sort of the more severe it becomes. So NAFLD is prevalent in around a quarter of the general population, and this reaches up to 70% in individuals with overweight and obesity, and as high as 90% in those with severe obesity. But in addition to these more severe liver-related outcomes, NAFLD is also associated with more metabolic dysfunctional outcomes, such as type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and the metabolic syndrome. But when we look at just liver fat itself, it's been found to be the strongest predictor of insulin resistance, not only in the liver, but also the adipose tissue and skeletal muscle when compared to other storage areas such as subcutaneous and visceral fat. So really, liver fat seems to be a really important factor underlying some of this metabolic dysfunction that we've been talking about. And this has become particularly relevant over the last year or so, as I'm sure many of you will have seen the different news headlines linking obesity to the severity of COVID-19 infections, but also mortality from COVID-19. Naturally, a recent proposal to try and tackle this has been the ban on junk food advertising after 9 p.m. So this has led to researchers also looking at whether these associations are evident in people with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So it's becoming really important, even more so, to try and treat these different conditions. So some of the research that we've been doing at Loughborough is looking at some of the relationships between our physical activity and fitness levels and these different storage locations and the adipose tissue insulin resistance, which I mentioned before. So this is a study which we recently done by one of our PhD students here at Loughborough called Sundus, and we're looking to publish these results over the next couple of months. So in this study, we combined data from 2 previous studies which we ran at Loughborough, and this was to create a larger pool of participants. So this ended up being 141 individuals, both males and females, with quite a large age range and also large ranges of BMI. So all these individuals underwent 7 days of monitoring of their physical activity and sedentary behavior using a hip-worn accelerometer. So sedentary behavior is any laying, sitting, or standing activity where there's no movement. They then also had a maximal exercise test on a treadmill, which determined their fitness level. They also had an MRI scan to determine their subcutaneous, visceral, and liver fat, and also a blood sample to look at their blood, fatty acids, and insulin, which gives us an indication of their adipose tissue insulin resistance. So what we're able to do is we're able to remove the influence of some of the factors which I mentioned on the slides before. So what we found was that regardless of a person's age, sex, ethnicity, BMI, and circulating metabolic biomarkers, we found that spending more time sedentary was associated with greater adipose tissue insulin resistance. And this relationship was more apparent in those who were older, less fit, and had a higher BMI. So what this suggests is that in these individuals in particular, it may be really important to reduce the amount of sedentary time to potentially improve adipose tissue insulin resistance. And what was quite interesting is that we also found that spending more time sedentary was associated with greater amounts of visceral fat. So if you remember back to that mechanism slide, we were talking about how adipose tissue insulin resistance might be quite important in that fat spillover and then storage in the more harmful storage locations. So it was interesting that sedentary time was a key factor linked with both of these. And this was more apparent in females compared to males. We also found that having higher fitness levels was associated with lower amounts of visceral and subcutaneous fat. And this relationship was more apparent in males and those with a higher BMI respectively. So what this potentially suggests is that increasing our fitness levels through regular exercise may be able to reduce both our visceral and subcutaneous fat stores. Interestingly, we didn't see any associations with liver fat, but one of the explanations that we thought for this might be due to the fact that we recruited quite healthy individuals from the general Leicestershire area. So the majority of people didn't actually have high amounts of liver fat. So it's worth pointing out on this slide that these are only associations, so are observations. So we can't tell for sure whether increase in exercise and increase in physical activity actually directly reduces these different fat storage locations. So in order to have a look at this in a bit more detail and look at the direct effects, we're going to look at a study run by a previous PhD student here at Loughborough called Jack Sargent. So the study he ran looked at the effect of exercise training on liver fat. And he did this by conducting what's called a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis takes all of the studies done in a research area and combines all of the effects into one overall effect. So he took all studies looking at exercise training in liver fat and combined this to create a larger amount of participants and also to see what the general effect was across all of the studies. So to do this, we searched 6 online databases for relevant studies, and studies were relevant if they included exercise training and measured liver fat using the spectroscopy technique that I mentioned before. So we found 17 studies overall, which included a total of 373 participants. So typical studies may have between 10 to 20 participants. So you can see how by doing this, you get a lot greater participant numbers. So the interventions included a range of different types of exercise. So this was aerobic and endurance training, high intensity interval training, resistance or strength training, and then combined different types of exercise. The average duration was between 1 to 24 weeks, and the training frequency was 2 to 7 times per week for 30 to 60 minutes. The participants' average age was around 50, a BMI of 30, so that obesity category, and also a liver fat of 16%, so well above that threshold for NAFLD. So all of the studies that were found were listed on the left here in what's called a forest plot. So the basic idea of a forest plot is to plot the individual changes in liver fat. So the 0 line here represents no change in liver fat. Anything to the right of this line suggests an increase in liver fat, and anything to the left suggests a decrease in liver fat. So Jack then split the studies into those which reported which didn't report any weight loss, and studies which did report some weight loss. So in the first group of studies, he found that studies which didn't see weight loss found that exercise training reduced liver fat by around 2%. When this was compared to studies which did see weight loss, exercise training resulted in about a 4.8% reduction in liver fat. And when all of the studies were combined, exercise training led to a 3% reduction in liver fat. So what these results suggest is that actually, independent of weight loss, exercise training may be able to reduce our liver fat. But when some weight loss is achieved, then this is over 2 times greater. So he then was able to plot the change in body weight against the change in liver fat. And what he found was that each 1% reduction in body weight was associated with a 0.9% reduction in liver fat. So put simply, the greater the reduction in body weight, the greater the reduction in liver fat. So it highlights the importance of weight loss in this. So the next question really is, well, what types of exercise training is most effective? So what we found was that aerobic or endurance exercise produced the largest reduction in liver fat. But the main caveat to this conclusion really is that the majority of the studies only used aerobic or exercise training, whereas the other types, you can see there was really only sort of 3 or 4 studies that have been run using these other types of exercise. So really, we need more research using these other types to have a solid conclusion around this. So that was the effects of exercise on ectopic fat in the liver. So now we're going to move on to looking at the evidence for diet. So the results I'm going to present here are from the DIRECT studies. This stands for Diabetes Remission Clinical Trial. So this is a really nice study being run by Glasgow and Newcastle University. And some of you may have heard of this study as they're trying to roll out the results within the NHS to test the treatment for type 2 diabetes. So there's been a few papers which have been published from this study already, but the one that we're going to talk about today is the one on the left here. So the overall premise of the study is to test the effectiveness of a weight management program, specifically a very low calorie diet, on the remission of type 2 diabetes. And as I mentioned before, this is now something which they're testing out within the NHS as a treatment for type 2 diabetes. So the DIRECT study recruited 306 patients with type 2 diabetes from GP practices in the Tyneside and Glasgow areas. Each GP practice was then randomized to either the intervention group, so this was the very low calorie diet structured weight management program, or the control group, which was the standard routine diabetes care, which we currently have in place within the NHS. So the participants were aged between 20 to 65, a BMI in the overweight or obesity category, and the participants also had diagnosed type 2 diabetes for less than 6 years. So the main outcomes of this study in particular were changes in liver fat and pancreatic fat over 6 to 12 months of this weight loss intervention. So the intervention group followed what's called the Counterweight Plus program. So this program split into 3 different phases. So within the first phase, it's a total dietary replacement phase. So this is replacing normal meals with sachets of soups and shakes that total about 820 to 850 kilocalories per day. So you can see that that's a very low amount of calories for someone each day. And this phase lasted between 12 to 20 weeks, depending on how quickly weight was lost. The second phase was then gradual food reintroduction. So over the next 2 to 8 weeks, there was a decrease in the amount of soups and shakes, which was then replaced by solid balanced meals. And again, this happened over 2 to 8 weeks, depending on the amount of weight lost. So these were the 2 weight loss phases, and then the participants entered what was a weight maintenance phase. So this was maintaining the weight loss from the first 2 phases. So this was through monthly 30-minute appointments with dietitians and nurses, again, to provide nutritional and physical activity advice and make sure participants stayed on track. And they were also advised to increase their physical activity to a maximum of 15,000 steps per day. So the overall aim of the Counterweight Plus program is to reduce body weight by at least 15 kilograms. So in the final analysis, the authors split the participants in the intervention group into those who responded and achieved the overall aim of the study, which was type 2 diabetes remission, and then the other group who didn't respond by not achieving the type 2 diabetes remission. So here we have the average weight lost by the different groups. So the solid black line is the responders, those who achieved type 2 diabetes remission, and the black dotted line is the non-responders. So what we see is that both groups achieved the target sort of weight loss of 15 kilograms. So you can see going from around 100 kilograms on average to around about 85 kilograms. And the very faint grey line there is the control group, obviously the standard routine diabetes care, and you can see weight was maintained over the 12 months. So on the right here, we have the changes in liver fat percentage. And you can see after the first 6 months in the intervention groups that there was a large decrease in liver fat percentage, going from around 15% down to below 5%. As I mentioned before, that 5.5% threshold is for NAFLD. You can see the participants actually reduced below that. Similarly, with pancreatic fat, there was more of a modest decrease, but both the responders and non-responders decreased to a similar amount, despite having differences in where they started. And this was then maintained over the next 12 months. But what I want to draw your attention to really is the changes in liver fat after 12 months. And what you can see in the non-responders, so those who didn't achieve type 2 diabetes remission, actually their liver fat rebounded in the weight maintenance phase, and they actually went above that 5.5% threshold, so effectively regained NAFLD. And what the authors found was that the regain in liver fat was directly proportional to the amount of weight that they regained over the 12 months. So what this shows quite nicely is that changes in weight are quite closely changed or quite closely related to changes in liver fat. So obviously weight loss is an important factor in this. So the take-home messages from part 1 really are in keeping with the title of the lecture. All fat is not equal. So central fat accumulation, particularly in ectopic areas, is more harmful for our health. And this results from an inability of our subcutaneous fat stores to adequately expand, which leads to a fat spillover into our circulation and subsequent delivery to those areas not designed for mass lipid storage. Regular exercise can reduce ectopic fat accumulation in the liver without significant weight loss. However, greater weight loss and maintenance through both diet and exercise is necessary for larger reductions in liver fat and also large improvements in our cardiometabolic health. So that was part 1, and talking about the importance of where we store our body fat. So now in part 2, we're going to look at the importance of the different types of fat that we're storing in our liver. So specifically, we're going to look at what are these different types of fat, how do these fats impact our metabolic health, and also can lifestyle interventions change the composition of our liver fat. So in the previous section, we saw how the amount of total liver fat that we have is important for our metabolic health. But actually, in addition to this, the composition may be important, if not more important, for our metabolic health. So similar to the fats that we can eat in our diet, liver fat can be stored as both saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fat. And studies done in cells and also animals have shown that saturated fat may be more harmful for our health. So within these models, it can induce stress and inflammation in our cells, again, promoting the death of the cells and also promoting insulin resistance. And on the flip side, polyunsaturated fat may be more protective through promoting the oxidization or burning of fat as a fuel, and also preventing the conversion of other macronutrients into fat. And actually, we've recently been writing a review on this topic, which again, we're hoping to publish in the next few months. But possibly the best evidence we have in humans at the moment for the importance of liver fat composition is this study done in 2016 by a group from Finland. So they recruited 125 patients with severe obesity undergoing bariatric surgery for weight loss. And the participants consented during the surgery to donate liver samples, which were then analysed for liver fat composition. So the authors divided the patients into 2 different groups. So the first was what we call metabolic NAFLD. So this is the NAFLD that we've been talking about before, where people have a fatty liver and also these metabolic health complications, such as insulin resistance, high blood sugar, high blood pressure, and a greater risk of cardiovascular disease. The other group is then what we call genetic NAFLD. So this is a variation in the PNPLA3 gene. And what's interesting in these individuals is that they typically develop a fatty liver, but don't develop the associated metabolic dysfunction. So they have a neutral risk of cardiovascular disease and remain insulin sensitive. So what this allows us to do is compare the two groups and see actually what could be driving these metabolic complications in the metabolic NAFLD group. So what we have here is the heat maps for the two different groups, and these heat maps show the different types of liver fat. So within the heat map, the further to the left we go is suggestive of saturated and monounsaturated fat, and typically the further to the right we go is suggestive of polyunsaturated fat. Now, using the color key, the hotter the color or the deeper the red color means higher amounts of these different fats, and more towards the left, the colder or stronger blue color suggests lower amounts of these different types of fats. So what the authors found was that the metabolic NAFLD, the more metabolically unhealthy group, was their livers were enriched with higher amounts of saturated and monounsaturated fat. And then comparing this to the genetic NAFLD group, so the more metabolically healthy, they found that their livers were enriched with higher amounts of polyunsaturated fat. And what you can see is that there's actually the stronger blue color suggestive of lower amounts of the saturated and monounsaturated fat. So how do we actually assess liver fat composition? Well, the gold standard method is the liver biopsy technique, which I spoke about before. But again, it is an invasive procedure, and it's not really suitable for when we want to take repeat measurements. So if we're interested in an intervention where we're looking at changes before and after, again, taking repeats of these isn't really feasible. But over the last 10 years, our spectroscopy technique has really advanced and developed. So now actually we can non-invasively determine the proportion of saturated, unsaturated, and polyunsaturated fat in the liver. So what we have on the left here is a typical spectroscopy scan of the liver. So this is quite different to an MRI scan, which you're used to seeing, which has images of the different organs. So this spectroscopy scan has different peaks which relate to different things within our liver. So this really large peak here represents the amount of water in our liver. And then we also get 6 smaller peaks which relate to the different fats within our liver. So peaks number 1 and number 3 are found in unsaturated fats, and peak number 2 is exclusively found in polyunsaturated fat. So what we can do is use validated equations to calculate different indexes of liver saturation, unsaturation, and polyunsaturation. So using this technique, here at Loughborough, we've developed 2 research questions which we're interested in answering. So the first is, in individuals with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, does liver fat composition differ in individuals with type 2 diabetes, i.e. have more metabolic complications, compared to those without type 2 diabetes? And also, can exercise training favourably change our liver fat composition? So to answer these 2 questions, we've been running the DELIVER study. So this stands for diabetes, exercise, and liver fat. So you'll see in science that we absolutely love an acronym. So the study itself is investigating the impact of type 2 diabetes and exercise on liver fat composition. So the study is split into 2 parts to answer the 2 different questions. So part A is a cross-sectional comparison of men with NAFLD, both with and without type 2 diabetes. Part B is then a 6-week exercise training intervention in men with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and type 2 diabetes. So the 2 groups that we recruited, this data I'm going to show you here differs very slightly, but I'll explain why. So the first group was a group with normal glucose regulation. So this would be a group without type 2 diabetes. The second group is a group with what we call impaired glucose regulation. So this includes individuals with type 2 diabetes, but also pre-diabetes, so those who have not yet gone on to develop type 2 diabetes. But the additional inclusion criteria for both of these groups were aged between 30 to 75, a BMI and waist circumference in the overweight and obesity categories, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease with the absence of excessive alcohol intake or other secondary causes, and also those who did have type 2 diabetes to only be being treated by lifestyle modification or metformin only. So we firstly screened people interested in the study over the phone, and those that were eligible were then invited to a first study visit. So this took place at the Sir Peter Mansfield Imaging Centre, where we took measures of their height, their weight, their BMI, waist circumference, and they also had a spectroscopy scan so that we could look at their liver fat composition. They then underwent 7 days of physical activity monitoring and a 3-day food record so that we could have a look what their normal sort of physical activity and dietary habits were. They then went to a second study visit, which took place at the Leicester Diabetes Centre. And here we took a blood sample to measure some different metabolic biomarkers and also to determine their HbA1c, which allowed us to allocate their group with normal or impaired glucose regulation. They then did a maximal exercise test to determine their fitness level. So the final group allocation was 12 in the normal glucose regulation and 15 in the impaired glucose regulation group. So what we found was really what we were expecting to begin with. So what we found was that those in the impaired glucose regulation group had a higher proportion of saturated fat and a lower proportion of unsaturated and polyunsaturated fat in their livers compared to the group with normal glucose regulation. So what this suggests is that this potentially more harmful lipid profile is associated with this more impaired glucose regulation. So interestingly, we found some good, interesting results when we looked at the associations of fitness level and physical activity with liver fat composition. So these graphs here show fitness level on the y-axis and liver fat composition on the x-axis. And what we found was that having a higher fitness level was associated with a lower proportion of saturated fat and a higher proportion of unsaturated and polyunsaturated fat in the liver. And then we also found that a higher proportion of saturated liver fat was associated with spending more time sedentary and also lower amounts of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So this gives us an initial insight into potentially increasing our fitness levels and increasing our physical activity levels could have a beneficial impact on altering our liver fat composition. So this hypothesis leads quite nicely onto the part B of the study. So the participants with type 2 diabetes were then taken forward into the second part of the study. So this is where they were randomized to either 6 weeks of exercise training or 6 weeks of the control intervention. And this just included maintaining normal day-to-day habits. So the exercise training itself involved 30 to 45 minutes of walking or cycling exercise at 70 to 75 maximum heart rate. So this is a moderate sort of walking intensity. So this occurred 4 times per week for the 6 weeks. 3 of these sessions were supervised by members of the research team, and then 1 was done unsupervised at home, either on a treadmill or walking out in the local area. However, I can't show you results today, unfortunately, because the study had to be paused due to COVID-19, and we've only had 5 people through the exercise training. However, what I can do is show you some preliminary findings from other research that's been done in the area, which helped to inform the research study. So this study on the right here was one conducted in 2013 and looked at the short-term effects of exercise on liver fat composition. So in this study, they recruited 17 people with NAFLD, and the mean age, BMI, and liver fat is shown there. So what they did was 7 consecutive days of treadmill walking for 60 minutes at 85% of maximum heart rate. So slightly more intense than what we're doing on the DELIVER study. So what they found was that 7 consecutive days of treadmill walking didn't change body weight over the 7 days. But what they did find was that the proportion of polyunsaturated fat was actually increased in the liver. So this more healthier lipid profile was then induced after the 7 days of consecutive walking. So this study here was conducted in 2019 and involved 2 24-week interventions. One was a comprehensive lifestyle intervention, and one was a soy protein-based meal replacement, so similar to the direct study that we spoke about before. So this was conducted in individuals with NASH, so that more severe form of liver disease. So the 22 individuals randomized to the two different interventions. So, sorry about that. So the first was the lifestyle modification. Actually, I realized the icons are switched the wrong way around. So the first intervention was the meal replacement. So this was replacing day-to-day meals with 1 to 2 shakes per day of soy protein. And this involved a calorie intake of 1,000 to 1,700 kilocalories per day, depending on the sex of the participant and also the length of time that they've been in the study. So this was done for 24 weeks. And the other intervention was a lifestyle change. So instead of the meal replacement, instead the participants just reduced the calories of their normal daily food intake to 1,200 to 1,800 kilocalories per day.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we've lost the slides.
What was that, sorry?
Sorry to interrupt you, Scott, but we've lost the slides. They're not being shared anymore.
Sorry, not sure what's happened there. There we go. Can you see that?
Yeah, that's great. They're back. Thank you.
Great. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, the first intervention was the meal replacement shakes. And then the second intervention was more of a lifestyle change. So reducing the amount of calories through daily food, but also doing 1 to 2 exercise classes per week, and also lifestyle education classes every 6 weeks. And again, this was for 24 weeks. So what the authors found was that both of the diet or lifestyle changes induced quite a large amount of weight loss, but they also found that it reduced the amount of saturated fat within the liver, so that so reducing the more harmful lipid profile. So what this data shows is that both lifestyle interventions and diet itself are also quite effective in altering the composition of our liver fat. So the take-home messages from part 2, again, all fat is not equal. So storing liver fat as saturated fat may be more metabolically harmful, whilst polyunsaturated fat may be more protective. And this appears to be true in humans as well. So individuals with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease with impaired glucose regulation is characterized by higher amounts of saturated liver fat and lower amounts of polyunsaturated liver fat. So initial evidence from the literature is promising that lifestyle interventions through both diet and exercise may be able to favorably change our liver fat composition. But clearly, we need to do more research in this area. So longer term exercise training interventions, like the one that we're doing on the DELIVER study, and also more prospective studies. So these are studies which follow changes in people's health over time and look at how this relates to changes in liver fat composition. So that's the end of today's talk. So I'll now invite people to ask any questions. So again, if you use the raise your hand feature when you have a question, and the moderators will come round and select to ask your question. If you've got any questions which you'd like to email me, then my email address is located in the top left there.